Before the world knew him as a movie star, before the characters and the fame, there was a young guy who only wanted one thing to matter: music. Johnny Depp didn't dream of red carpets or blockbuster films. He dreamed of guitar strings cutting into his fingers, late-night jam sessions, and the feeling of losing himself on stage. Acting wasn't the goal, it was the detour. This is not a story about Hollywood luck, it's about a musician who accidentally became an actor, and how that unfinished dream quietly shaped every role, every risk, and every strange choice that followed. Johnny Depp grew up in a world that never felt stable, never felt permanent, and maybe that is why music became the only thing that felt real to him. As a teenager, he wasn't thinking about fame or success, he was thinking about escape. His family moved constantly, different houses, different cities, different versions of life, and in the middle of all that chaos he found a guitar. It wasn't just an instrument, it was a lifeline. He taught himself how to play, spending hours locked in his room, fingers sore, ears ringing, chasing a sound that made sense when nothing else did. School didn't matter to him the way music did. Teachers, grades, routines, all of it felt pointless compared to the feeling of creating something with his own hands. By the time he was 15, he had already made a decision most people are too afraid to make even as adults. He dropped out of high school because in his mind there was only one future worth chasing: becoming a musician. He didn't see this as rebellion, he saw it as honesty. He wasn't built for a normal life, and he knew it early. While others his age were planning college or steady jobs, Johnny was chasing gigs, rehearsals, and bands that barely scraped by. He joined a local rock band and for the first time felt like he belonged somewhere. The band wasn't famous, it wasn't rich, but it was real. They played small venues, bars, anywhere that would let them set up their equipment. Sometimes they got paid, sometimes they didn't, but none of that mattered to him. What mattered was the sound, the connection, the dream that one day this struggle would turn into something bigger. Music wasn't just a hobby, it was his identity. He didn't imagine himself as an actor playing musicians in movies, he imagined himself on tour, albums being recorded, nights spent on the road. His heroes weren't movie stars, they were rock legends. He studied them, their style, their attitude, the way they carried themselves like outsiders who didn't need permission to exist. That influence would later show up in strange ways, but at the time he didn't know that. All he knew was that he wanted to live inside music, not watch it from the outside. Eventually his band moved to Los Angeles, the city where dreams either happen or die quietly. They believed this was the place where everything would change. Reality, however, was harsher. The music industry wasn't waiting for them. They struggled to survive, working odd jobs, sleeping on couches, barely holding things together. The band didn't take off the way they hoped, and slowly the cracks started to show. The pressure, the disappointment, the financial stress, it all began to weigh heavy. Johnny found himself in a place where his dream was still alive, but the path forward was disappearing. It was during this time that acting entered his life, not as a passion, but as a suggestion. Someone close to him mentioned auditions, mentioned commercials, mentioned the possibility of making money while the band figured things out. At first, he resisted the idea. Acting wasn't his dream, it felt like a distraction, maybe even a betrayal of the life he wanted. But survival has a way of forcing choices. He needed money, he needed stability, and acting seemed like a temporary solution. Just something to pay the bills until music worked out. His first auditions weren't fueled by ambition, they were fueled by necessity. He wasn't trying to become a star, he was trying to keep going. Surprisingly, casting directors noticed him. There was something different about him, something raw and unpolished. He didn't act like someone desperate for attention. He didn't perform in the way people expected. He was quiet, awkward, unpredictable, and that made him interesting. Roles started coming, small at first, then bigger. He landed a part in a television series that suddenly put his face everywhere. People recognized him, talked about him, labeled him a teen idol. This should have felt like success, but to Johnny it felt wrong. Being famous for acting was never the plan. The attention made him uncomfortable. He didn't want to be known as a heartthrob, didn't want to be boxed into something he didn't believe in. While the world saw a rising actor, he saw himself drifting further away from his original dream. Music was still there, still calling, but now it had competition, and not the kind he wanted. Even as his acting career grew, he never let go of music. He played whenever he could, wrote songs, collaborated with other musicians, stayed connected to that part of himself. Music grounded him in a way acting never fully did. Acting felt like pretending, music felt like truth. That distinction mattered deeply to him. When he chose roles, he wasn't chasing fame, he was chasing freedom. He wanted characters that felt like outsiders, misfits, people who didn't belong. In a strange way, those roles allowed him to express the same rebellion and emotion he once poured into music. Hollywood didn't know what to do with him at first. He refused safe choices, turned down roles that would have made him a bigger star faster. He didn't want to be predictable. He wanted to stay weird, stay uncomfortable, stay honest. That mindset came directly from his years as a struggling musician, where fitting in was never the goal. The industry pressured him, critics questioned him, but he didn't care. He wasn't chasing approval, he was chasing authenticity. The more successful he became as an actor, the more people assumed this was what he always wanted. They rewrote his story for him, turning him into someone who dreamed of movies since childhood. But that wasn't true. Deep down, he still saw himself as a musician who took a wrong turn and somehow ended up famous. Even when he stood on the biggest stages in the world, there was a part of him that belonged in a small room with a guitar, chasing a sound only he could hear. This internal conflict shaped everything about him. It made him restless, creative, and sometimes self-destructive. He never fully accepted Hollywood's rules because he never planned to live by them. Music taught him that art comes from pain, risk, and honesty, not from playing it safe. That philosophy guided his career, even when it cost him comfort or approval. Every strange role, every unexpected choice, carried the spirit of a musician who never stopped searching for something real. As the years went on, his connection to music didn't fade, it evolved. He played with legendary artists, formed bands, and continued to perform live, not as a movie star pretending to be a musician, but as someone who genuinely belonged there. When he was on stage with a guitar, there was no acting involved. That was the truest version of him. No script, no character, just sound and emotion. The irony is that acting gave him the platform to live out parts of his musical dream. Without movies, he might never have had the chance to play with the people he admired growing up. Without fame, his music might have stayed hidden in small rooms forever. Yet despite all that, he never confused the two paths. Acting was what he did, music was who he was. That distinction never changed. This is why his performances feel different. There is a rhythm to them, a musicality in the way he moves, speaks, and exists on screen. He approaches characters the way a musician approaches a song, feeling his way through instead of calculating every note. That instinct came from years of playing music without rules, without guarantees. It came from nights where failure was more likely than success, but the passion made it worth it. By the time the world fully accepted him as a serious actor, his identity was already set. He wasn't looking for validation, he wasn't trying to prove anything. He was simply following the same instinct that led him to pick up a guitar as a teenager. That instinct didn't care about categories or labels, it only cared about expression. And yet, even with all this success, there was always a sense that something remained unfinished, a dream that never fully closed. Music was not a chapter that ended, it was a thread that ran through everything. It influenced his choices, his friendships, his lifestyle, and even his struggles. It reminded him of who he was before the world started watching, before expectations took over. That young kid who dropped out of school with nothing but a guitar and a belief in sound never disappeared. He just learned how to survive in a world that tried to turn him into something else. Acting became the mask, music remained the face underneath, and as his journey continued, that tension between who he was and who he became only grew stronger, pushing him toward decisions that would later define not just his career but his legacy. That tension became louder as time went on because the further he traveled into Hollywood, the more distant his original dream felt. He was now surrounded by contracts, expectations, schedules, and people who saw him as a brand instead of a person. Yet inside, nothing had changed. He still measured his life in songs, not awards. When film sets went quiet at night, he would reach for a guitar instead of celebrating another successful day of acting. Music remained his refuge, the one place where he didn't have to explain himself. The characters he chose began to reflect this inner struggle. They were often broken, misunderstood, drifting between worlds, never fully at home. These weren't safe roles, and they confused studios and audiences at first. But Johnny didn't care about being understood by everyone. He cared about staying true to the feeling that first pushed him toward music. In many ways, every character was like a song he was trying to write with his body instead of his hands. Rhythm, silence, pauses, chaos, all of it mattered more to him than dialogue alone. As his fame increased, so did the pressure to conform. People wanted sequels, formulas, repetition. They wanted him to stay inside a box that was profitable and predictable. But a musician's mindset doesn't work like that. Musicians chase evolution, not repetition. They experiment, they fail publicly, they risk losing everything just to find a new sound. Johnny carried that same mentality into acting, even when it confused those around him. When a role scared him or made no sense on paper, that was usually the one he wanted most. Music also shaped how he handled success and failure. Applause never meant as much to him as honesty. Criticism didn't break him the way it breaks people who crave approval. He had already lived in a world where rejection was constant and success was rare. Years of being ignored as a musician taught him resilience. It taught him that art doesn't need permission. That lesson stayed with him long after the band days were over. Despite everything, he never presented himself as someone who had made it. Even at the height of his acting career, he spoke like someone passing through, not someone who had arrived. Interviews often revealed his discomfort with fame and his longing for a simpler, more authentic creative life. He didn't romanticize Hollywood. If anything, he seemed wary of it. Music had shown him how quickly industries chew people up, and he was determined not to let that happen to his identity. When he formed bands later in life and played alongside musicians he admired, it wasn't a publicity move. It was personal. Standing on stage with a guitar, he wasn't a movie star slumming it in music. He was finally standing where he believed he belonged. Those moments mattered to him in ways no award ceremony ever could. There was no script, no camera angles, no second takes. Just sound, timing, and connection. For him, that was freedom. His life, however, was never simple. The same sensitivity that made him a passionate musician also made him vulnerable. Emotional intensity, creative obsession, and the need to feel deeply came with consequences. Music had always been an emotional outlet, but fame complicated that outlet. The more visible he became, the harder it was to protect the rawness that fueled his creativity. That struggle showed itself in his personal life, his choices, and his battles. Still, through every rise and fall, music remained consistent. It didn't judge him, didn't demand explanations, didn't ask him to be anything other than honest. Even during the most turbulent periods of his life, he returned to music as a way to process pain and confusion. When words failed him in interviews or public appearances, melodies did the talking instead. It was the language he trusted most. People often misunderstand his journey because they see success as a straight line. But Johnny's life was never linear. It was more like a song that keeps changing tempo. Moments of beauty followed by noise, silence followed by intensity. Acting brought him wealth and recognition, but music gave him meaning. One fed his life, the other fed his soul. Without music, acting would have felt hollow. Without acting, music might have remained unheard. Together, they formed a complicated balance he was constantly trying to maintain. What makes his story powerful is not that he became famous, but that he never forgot who he was before fame found him. The kid who dropped out of school to chase a sound never disappeared. He just learned how to survive in a world that tried to redefine him. Even now, when people speak his name, they often talk about characters in films. But if you listen closely, you can hear the rhythm underneath it all, the heartbeat of a musician who never stopped listening. This is why his legacy can't be explained by box office numbers alone. It lives in the risks he took, the choices that didn't make sense, and the constant pull towards something deeper than success. He didn't want to be perfect, he wanted to be real. That desire came long before cameras and scripts. It started with a guitar, a restless mind, and the belief that music could be a way out. In the end, Johnny Depp didn't abandon his dream of being a musician. He carried it with him into every chapter of his life. It shaped how he worked, how he lived, and how he saw the world. Acting may have been the path that made him famous, but music was the path that made him himself. And no matter how many roles he played, that truth never changed. If this story changed the way you see Johnny Depp, don't let it end here. Like, share, and subscribe because there are more stories like this waiting to be told. Stories about dreams that take unexpected turns, about artists who never give up on who they truly are. Drop a comment and tell me what surprised you most, or which artist's hidden journey you want to hear next. Your support keeps these voices alive, and your curiosity keeps these stories coming.